beginning of the webinar, this webinar will be archived. So if you missed something or would like to hear the entire webinar again, or you simply would like to see the presentation again, they will all be published to the ILA website within 24 hours. You will receive an email with instructions for accessing the archive recording after the webinar has ended. Second, I'd like to explain how we handle questions during the webinar. We welcome your questions throughout the webinar, so at any time you may ask your questions by typing them into the questions box, which you'll see on your webinar control panel, which is currently displayed on the right-hand side of your screen. While we'll be collecting your questions throughout the webinar, we will address questions during the second half of our hour together. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. It's both a pleasure and a bit of a job to introduce Professor Barbara Kellerman. It's a pleasure because I had the chance to work closely with Professor Kellerman for some 8+ years at Harvard Center for Public Leadership, for which she was the founding executive director. This fall, she is visiting professor of leadership at Dartmouth University. It's also a bit of a job because Professor Kellerman has one of those CVs that when you review it and think that you only have a few minutes for the introduction, you think, geez, how am I going to make this fit? Let me try and give you a feel for why I'm so excited to kick off this session in particular on behalf of the ILA. Professor Kellerman is a leader in leadership studies. As I mentioned, she currently holds the James McGregor Burns Lecturership at the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard. She was the founding executive director of the Kennedy School Center for Public Leadership from 2000 to 2003. And then from 2003 to 2006, she served as the center's research director. She has held professorships at Fordham, Tufts, Farley Dickinson, George Washington, and Uppsala universities. She also served as the Dean of Graduate Studies and Research at Farley Dickinson and as director of the Center for the Advanced Study of Leadership at the Academy of Leadership at the University of Maryland. She received her BA from Sarah Lawrence, her MA and MPhil, and PhD from Yale University. She's been awarded a Danforth Fellowship and 3 Fulbright Fellowships. She served as co-founder of the ILA, the International Leadership Association, and is author and editor of many books, including Leadership, Multidisciplinary Perspectives, The Political Presidency, Practice of Leadership, and Reinventing Leadership, Making the Connection Between Politics and Business. Some of her most recent books are Bad Leadership, What It Is, How It Happens, Why It Matters, a co-edited volume, Women in Leadership, State of Play, Strategies for Change, and most recently, Followership, How Followers Are Creating Change and Changing Leaders. She speaks to audiences around the world, in recent years Berlin, London, Moscow, Rome, Shanghai, Zurich, Jerusalem, Toronto, Montreal, and I believe today through ILA's platform we will have guests from many of these locations as well as many more. I'm particularly excited that today's talk will draw on her most recent research project, which is summarized in her latest book, Leadership Essentials: Selections on Power, Authority, and Influence. It was published this summer by McGraw-Hill. With that, let me turn our webinar over to Professor Barbara Kellerman.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you so much for the generous introduction, and welcome to everyone who is listening to me as I sit here in my office in Hanover, New Hampshire, looking out on trees that are just starting to change color. So I am talking today, just as Todd said, about this relatively new book, which is, however, not new to me, since the book is the product of a course that I began teaching at the Harvard Kennedy School about 5-6 years ago, and I'm currently teaching in somewhat different form for the first time to undergraduates. They're my guinea pigs here, these undergraduate students at Dartmouth College. So the genesis of the book, as you can imagine, grows out of what is a lifetime of, most of you who know my name a little bit know that I've spent most of my professional life thinking about leadership and fairly stunned at what has happened to the study of leadership, the teaching of leadership, particularly leadership development and education over the last 10, 20, and now 30 years. I call it, and as you can see on your screen now, I call this the leadership industry, what's happened to leadership in the last several decades, because it has become, in my view, a money-making proposition for many people, many of us, particularly those of us who've been around for a while. Not that we necessarily get rich off of it, but we do make a living trying to either talk about leadership or teach leadership. I'm particularly interested in the teaching of leadership, especially because exactly what we teach and to whom and how we teach it really remains open to debate, as does the effectiveness of what we're doing. So that's essentially what I'm going to be talking about today, is how does one teach leadership? And as those of you who have paid any attention at all to the book that I'm talking about, and I'm sure most of you did, otherwise you wouldn't be here today, understand what I have done is kind of go backwards in a way, that is to the liberal arts, although I think of it as the liberal arts embedded very much in a 21st century context. And that's what I'm really addressing in this book and in my courses, and we'll be talking about for the next few minutes. The assumptions you can see in front of you: that leadership can be taught, that there's a virtue to being a leader, that this is something we should aspire to be. In other words, everybody takes classes on leadership or wants to take classes on leadership or courses on leadership or coaching on leadership or training on leadership. Very few, as to refer back to a book that I wrote, Study How to Be a Follower. And similarly, unlike what used to be the case in ancient times, if you go back to Machiavelli or to Plato, where the teaching of leadership was reserved for a very, very special few, we have democratized the idea. We have democratized the idea that not only should most of us train to be leaders, but most of us can be leaders. But there is this problem, which is exactly what do we teach and how. Again, it refers, I should point out, to a larger debate in higher education more generally. And I'm going to quote to you from an article that was in the Wall Street Journal just a few weeks ago. The headline, it was an op-ed, where the headline was "Where Columbia Beats Harvard." And the article addressed the question of how Columbia has held on to the liberal arts for its undergraduate education, whereas Harvard has gone to a much more diffuse and diverse curriculum. And this particular author, James Pearson, writes, "Columbia now finds itself in the company of an expanding list of colleges and universities offering courses of study in the great books, in some cases as core curricular and in others as elective options for students interested in such an education." Similarly, business schools have wrestled recently with what exactly do we teach people who want to be leaders. And now I'm quoting from another article in the Wall Street Journal that was a few months ago, and it reads, "As a result, a number of prominent business schools have reevaluated and in some cases redesigned their MBA programs, trying to move into courses traditionally associated with the liberal arts, multidisciplinary approaches, and an understanding of the global and historical context." In other words, I am embedding this particular book and this particular conversation in the larger context of what do we now teach people. What do we teach them when they're undergraduates? What do we teach them at the graduate level? And if we're going to teach leadership, what exactly is it that we should be teaching? So you can see Khurana's conclusion in his book, which came out a couple of years ago, not a very optimistic one if you're interested in some coherent approach to the teaching of leadership. And if you're interested in the notion that we have reached some objective conclusions, some coherence, to use his words, that there is a body of research that is reflected in the pedagogy of leadership. Needless to say, by and large, I agree with this rather skeptical conclusion, and it's one of the reasons I have gone, if you will, backwards. Broadly speaking, leadership education and training, leadership development can be divided into the three approaches that I describe here, that are described here. Khurana has more or less the same ones: transmission of knowledge, development of interpersonal skills, and personal growth and self-discovery. However, each of these approaches seems to leave something lacking. Again, we're all doing our best here, but no clear solution has been found, which brings us to, for example, the constant moaning of the leadership crisis, the pervasive feeling that the leadership industry of the last 10, 20, or 30 years notwithstanding, it's not in ample evidence that we're surrounded by better leaders either in the corporate sector or in the public sector, not necessarily in the United States, nor in Europe, nor in Asia, so forth and so on. In other words, we don't have a lot of evidence that what we've been doing for the last 30 years has made an incredible difference. What exactly are some of the problems? These are problems of the three approaches that were alluded to earlier. Just let me go back in terms of the slides. Here are the different approaches, and here are some of the problems. If you're going to transmit knowledge, those of us who are in the business of transmitting knowledge wonder what knowledge exactly we should be transmitting. If we're going to focus on the application of interpersonal skills, I, who am very interested in the impact of technology on patterns of dominance and deference, on leadership and followership in the late 20th and also obviously now in the 21st century, I think we need to ask ourselves about the relevance of interpersonal skills in a wired world, or at least we need to be asking ourselves, how does a wired world impact on the patterns of dominance and deference to which I just alluded? And finally, the issues of self-reference and self-discovery, they're extremely important, but I'm simply raising the question of whether they're adequate in a world in which it's so obvious that context matters, and that followers, and those of you who know my work know that I'm particularly interested in the increasing, what I consider, shift in balance of power between leaders and followers, that is, leaders struggling more and working harder to exercise power, influence, and authority, whereas followers seeming to be accruing more, at least power and influence, if not necessarily, by definition, authority. So given some of these questions and uncertainties, I'm not proposing that my answer here is any kind of a cure-all. I'm simply offering a new alternative, and I am suggesting that, in fact, the great books approach that I just cited, that is, again, achieving a certain kind of re-entry into the world of undergraduate and graduate education, that the great books approach, and I can't think of a more economical way of describing my approach here, has a profound and important validity for the study of leadership and, by definition, therefore, of followership. It is going back to the liberal arts. It is assuming that there is a body of work on leadership that goes back to Lao Tzu, which is where I begin in this book, and Confucius and Plato and Machiavelli. That's going all the way back to the beginning. That does constitute what I consider a core curriculum, a fabulous, and as it turns out, pedagogically wonderfully exciting way of teaching students at whatever level, and I'm finding, I must say, a high level of enthusiasm, at least so far. This could change tomorrow. Enthusiasm and interest here at Dartmouth among undergraduates which is that the great books have a tremendous amount to say to us, and that they do constitute a core of leadership learning, which other people who are interested in the pedagogy of leadership may wish to consider for themselves. So let me simply go through now some very quick points I want to make, and then I want to end my comments with a few very specific examples. And I'm going to move through these very fast, simply in the interest of time, and I hope those of you who are listening don't feel I'm moving along too quickly. Number one, as I found when I developed the course at the Kennedy School, there is a leadership canon. It's not a leadership canon that any of us have historically claimed. That is a bunch of series of, a group of great books that does constitute a core curriculum. I have developed my idea of a core curriculum, but as I am pointing out in item 2, what I consider a core curriculum is not inscribed in stone. In other words, you might look at what I consider the great books and think this is something of an interesting idea, but there might be some that some of my listeners, should they ever adopt this approach, wish to drop, and they may want to add some others. And often students have their own ideas about what should be added. So I don't mean to suggest for a moment that this is inscribed in stone. The canon is, it must be, of course, as leadership is, multidisciplinary and multicultural. I find the canon consists of 3 different categories of literature. Leadership literature. One is leadership literature, you try saying that. One is leadership literature that is about leadership. Another is leadership literature that is literature as an act of leadership, and I will give examples later. And the third group is literature, it can be oratory, that is by leaders themselves. The canon can be divided in different ways. I divide it according to the divisions I mentioned in number 4, but also chronologically. You will not be surprised to hear me feel, and I think this comes through incredibly strongly, that the great literature on leadership it has to be, by definition, simultaneously the great literature on followership. This leadership literature is, sometimes it's about power, sometimes it's about authority, sometimes it's about influence. The leadership literature is in itself a lesson in human history, because as I suggested earlier, what we find throughout human history, and this is continuing into the 21st century, power and influence in particular are shifting from the very top to the middle and even on down to the bottom. Number 9, what we find when we look at this literature is how powerful is the pen, pardon the cliche, sometimes mightier than the sword. And the great leadership literature is like all classical literature. It is timeless and it is transcendent. These are some of the themes that resonate from the literature itself. The importance of instruction. From time immemorial, people have believed, some of the greatest, some of the best and the brightest, that leadership can be taught. Although, as I implied earlier, what's different in the 21st century is that we now believe leadership can be taught rather quickly. People like Plato thought it had to be a lifetime of learning. And we also believe it can be taught to the many rather than merely only to the few. The leadership literature is grounded in your view of the human condition, your view of how human beings are, what is the definition of human nature. That gives birth to how you see the world of dominance and deference. The role of anger. Anger has fueled some of the greatest leadership literature ever. I will give you some examples in a moment. The attraction throughout human history, my emphasis on the follower notwithstanding, of the great man. It's been with us since the beginning. It is with us still. We cannot seem to shake it. I suppose it means we're hardwired. Numbers 5 and 6 and 7 I've touched on already, so I won't say any more. And number 8, 9, and 10, I think you're understanding now that these are the different categories in which I've divided the whole leadership canon. A few examples just to give you an idea. I wish I could read to you from the book because some of this work is so great. I wish I could convey it in the words of the original authors. But these are 3 of those who have written so eloquently. Believe it or not, Dartmouth undergraduates resonated just yesterday astonishingly well to the instruction of Lao Tzu, leadership by non-doing, which is in such opposition to our frenetic world of leaders always have to be doing something. Machiavelli goes without saying, of course. Du Bois, the talented tenth, his notion early in his lifetime of studying these things, that if you taught the top 10th tier, the smartest and the brightest, a little bit like the best and the brightest, you would develop a leadership cadre. Theme number 2, the view of human nature. Some examples in the book, Hobbes and Freud. Hitler, by the way, is not in the book. I teach Hitler. The publisher was squeamish about including Hitler and 1 or 2 others in the book, simply because Hitler is so full of hate, obviously. I find teaching Hitler, Mein Kampf, of course, extraordinarily illuminating for students and for even adult learners, because reading that literature and understanding how viewing human nature in a certain way affects how you lead is instructive. It's sobering and saddening, but it's extremely instructive. Theme number 3, the role of rage and outrage. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin I use. Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. I cannot tell you what interesting conversations that leads to, because no one is more articulate than is Frantz Fanon about how leaders sometimes must resort to violence in order to create change. It's not about getting students to propagate or believe in violence, but it is getting them to understand why in human history leaders do sometimes resort to violence, especially if they are leading from the bottom up and feel it's the only way they can properly lead. Larry Kramer, is the AIDS activist. There's a text in the book that is full of curse words that reveals his rage, and he, through his literature as well as his activism, changed America's understanding of and ultimately approach to AIDS. The attraction of the great man. I don't have to spell out Plato and the philosopher King. I'm sure for most of you I don't have to spell out Carlyle's interest in the hero in history. Lenin's text. I use Lenin's text to show how to make a revolution. His text, What is to be Done, the importance of a few key leaders, in Lenin's view this is, in instigating revolution. He wrote What is to be Done in 1903. By the way, the book itself explains every one of these texts. I provide in the book extended commentary on why I'm including these people and how they relate to leadership learning, Lenin being a prime example, although I realize full well he's not normally part of our leadership curriculum. I think we could do worse than teach our students or teach leaders in action what Lenin had to say about leadership. Theme number 5, the rise of the follower, how this shifts during the Enlightenment. And believe it or not, Hobbes is the first. I don't have time to go into it again, but Hobbes is the first to shift to the follower. Mary Parker Follett, the brilliant and only relatively recently acclaimed student of largely corporate leadership, how she focuses on the follower. And I include in the book, and I include for my classes and when I'm teaching adult learners, people in the world of work, Stanley Milgram's Obedience to Authority, not because the text itself is a classic. It is not. But most of you know, of course, that his experiments on obedience to authority, which his book on the subject vividly describes, are arguably the most important social scientific experiment of all time. and how not to include it. How not to include how Milgram, in the wake of World War II, in his quest to understand the Holocaust in particular, focused on the follower, and that has led us, students of leadership and followership, also to focus on the follower forevermore. The growing inclusivity, theme number 6, women like Wollstonecraft, who of course wrote about the rise of women and women's quietly and then much more noisily demanding to be heard. Martin Luther King goes without saying, no matter where you are in the world, listening to me. But let me say a word about Peter Singer's great, great, great text from 1975 titled Animal Liberation. It started the modern animal rights movement. Peter Singer, originally from Australia, now based at Princeton, a philosopher. There is no better evidence of how the word can be so powerful. His book started an important late 20th and 21st century movement, the animal rights movement, which of course is part of all the rights movements that started in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The power of the pen. I use these books, Paine's Common Sense, Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. Lovely to read the Communist Manifesto along with your students and to understand how that rallying cry, workers of the world unite, is a leadership cry. It's a leadership cry that, however, is bringing in more and more followers. How important a document was the Communist Manifesto, as of course the other two documents that I refer to here as well. By the way, these are of course only examples of the 10 themes in the book, and in my class we provide a much longer list. Theme 8, leadership literature as literature. Again, I wish I had time to read you the opening lines, for example, of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Again, a change agent in and of itself, leadership as literature, literature as leadership. The prose of the Silent Spring in parts is gorgeous, belongs as much in a course on literature as it does in a course on leadership. It belongs to the ages as an example of how words can change human behavior. Literature about leadership. They are reading, students of mine read these 3, among others, where you simply have some of the great thinkers in human history. We all know Max Weber's 3 different types of leadership, for example. So there's the literature that is about leadership. And finally, the last theme that I will take your time with today is literature as leaders speaking or as leaders writing. I particularly focus on Churchill's speeches in the 1930s while England slept, so to speak. Every one of them marvels of oratory, marvels of literature, marvels of leadership. I will set Havel aside for now and say simply about Mandela. What I use here is not one of his recent speeches, not one of those that he gave after he came out of jail, but the last speech he gave at the Rivonia trial in 1964 as he was being, the death sentence was commuted, but as he went to jail for 24 years. The speech ends with the line, "I am prepared to die." And again, it is an incredibly moving statement of how a person who is apparently without any power whatsoever, he was after all about to be taken away for nearly 3 decades, can use words to change the human condition. I wish all leadership courses had all of the arts, and I showed just a few examples here. What I would do if I were queen of the leadership world, I would do not just literature, but I would do art, I would do music, and of course I would do drama and fiction as well. Let me close only with a reference to this brilliant leadership essay by George Orwell called Shooting an Elephant. Ostensibly, Shooting an Elephant, it's a short story which many of you have probably read. Ostensibly, it's about imperialism. But I often read it to my students, or I should say have students read it, because there is no more vivid short story than this one to describe the tension between leaders and followers. For those of you who know the story, you'll know it's about a British official in Burma in the 30s who does not want to do what he's being pushed to do, which is to shoot an elephant which briefly was on the rampage. But he is being pushed and pushed by the growing crowd to shoot this great beast that is now returned to its peaceable state. He ends up shooting it. He ends up doing, in other words, not what he, the person in position of authority, wants to do, but rather what his followers want him to do. And Orwell describes with great pathos and great beauty the death of the great beast. So between the gorgeousness of Orwell's language and the instruction of the tension between leader and led, I leave you with that as I close my comments and turn to your questions about being leadership literate.
Okay, you have given us a tremendous amount to think about and, of course, to talk about in the time that we have. Let me mention to folks in our audience that we are starting to get questions in. So anyone who has a passion for posing their question, please do get it in sooner than later as the questions start to pile up. What I'd like to do is begin with the actual first question that came in. And Barbara, it talks a little bit about your referencing earlier to a wired world. And the question is, do we need interpersonal skills in a wired world? And what I would like to tack on to that question, if I could, is just more generally, if you'd reflect a little bit on what might at first seem to be a tension between looking to classic texts and at the same time recognizing that our world today, with everything from our social media, Facebook, tweets, and whether you see a disjuncture or an exciting connection between the classic canon and some of the sort of phenomena that are emerging in our world today.
Right. Thank you, questioner, and thank you, Todd. It is one of my favorite themes, that is, the impact of a wired world on leading and following, on patterns of dominance and deference. I, in fact, think it's one of the most interesting things that has happened in the leadership world in all of human history, and I think we have no idea really what to do with it. It's essentially not taught, which is what is not taught. That is the impact, for example, of cell phone technology, of internet technology, of the blogosphere, of tweeting, of giving voice to so many millions of people who never before had a voice, of leaders being pushed in certain directions much more aggressively than in Orwell's time, instantly because of being wired. So I do think it raises, for those of us who do teach how to be interpersonally skilled, it's not that it's unimportant. I am not arguing that learning how to be interpersonally skilled is unimportant to leadership. It's just that I think it now needs to be supplemented by a far richer and deeper understanding of what is the impact of this wired world on patterns of dominance and deference. My return to the classics is, if you will, a certain kind of response to the wired world, because what you find in these classics, and I used the word earlier, these two words earlier, is that they are timeless and transcendent. So interestingly, unlike interpersonal skills, where we can say, are they less relevant now, reading Machiavelli in a wired world is no less relevant. Reading even Lao Tzu or Confucius or any of the greats, the idea of words as agents of change, and in fact resonate in a wired world, which depends, curiously, on language. It's language that's shorter, it's language that's transmitted much more quickly, but being wired is to be aware, perhaps more than we've been, again, in a very, 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 very long time, of the importance of language, of words, as a leadership tool.
Terrific. And I'm going to move the questions at a pretty quick pace because they've started coming in and we've got lots of interesting ones. Thank you, Les, for that question. Julie asks how you would think about the curriculum you've outlined for use in inside organizations. So for people who are trying to build leadership and professional skills and develop people within organizations.
Yeah, that's a great question, Julie, because it appears to have no practical application. You know, it is going back to this tension between what do we learn as an adult or even as a college student. Do we learn liberal arts? Do we learn practical skills? You know, I have yet to find, and I've only been doing this 5 or 6 years, so I'm still new at it, that is this particular classical approach to leadership education. But I have yet to find learners, including adult learners who are in the world of work, who do not resonate to these materials. They are not, of course, how-to materials. I tell my students, and in fact I've told my students this all along, I personally, I realize I have many wonderful colleagues who do teach how to lead. I do not teach how to lead, I teach about leadership. But I think if you're doing the about stuff correctly, wisely, and well, that has an effect. Osmosis, not necessarily in the moment, but down the line, in a month or in a year or later on. How can thinking these great thoughts, reading these great works, having these absolutely fabulous conversations not impact positively on leading wisely and well?
Terrific. Barbara, Eric asks a little bit about the actual running a class around these courses. So do you require your students to purchase the text? Do you have recommendations for compilation? I should mention that these works are all compiled in Professor Kellerman's latest book, which is Leadership Essential Selections on Power, Authority, and Influence, out from McGraw-Hill this past summer. But tacking on to that, if I could, a question from Richard about why Orwell is referenced in your talk but doesn't make it into the book, and then a second question about the Bible and whether you were tempted to include selections from the Bible in the anthology.
Thank you, all of you, for your questions. Let me talk about teaching it, and then I'll talk about Orwell and the Bible. As I said, I started teaching this course 5, 6 years ago at the Kennedy School. Of course, there was no book. I didn't have a book then. The book is just a few weeks or a few months old. And I simply, you know, I relied on my own education. I relied on a couple of colleagues. And I relied, as I went from term to term on this, on my students, all of whom gave me ideas, in addition to my own. As I said, I've been, as most of you know, I'm not a newcomer to this field, on my own experience of what is the great leadership literature. So in the beginning, there was no book. I had nothing to rely on, and I would simply copy materials, and I would develop my own course reader for the book. This semester, I used my own book, Leadership Essential Selections, the one that Todd just spoke about. But it's not the only thing I use, because you know, I of course wanted to do an encyclopedic collection of the great leadership literature, but my publisher said, no, you may not. We actually want to sell the book. So I supplement my own book with other readings, some of which is great leadership literature, some of which simply enhances that literature in some other way. So for this semester, there are 2 basic texts. One is my own course reader, but the primary text, of course, is my own book. And I also suggest, I don't require that students buy for their own libraries, pardon this quaint word in the day of the e-reader, Machiavelli's The Prince, the Communist Manifesto, and 1 or 2 other slight volumes, because I like the idea that students should understand some books are so wonderful that they should be owned. Just one more word about the class, although I wasn't asked about it. It's an incredibly lively class. I've been startled even here at Dartmouth. These adult learners, these younger learners now, they're just excited by the opportunity to talk about life and death and leadership and followership. And needless to say, this literature is not just about leadership and followership. It is also, I can assure you, when we talk about Mandela, we talk about Hitler, we talk about Lenin, we are talking about life and death and the importance to leadership and followership of life and death. Orwell hit the cutting room floor for the same reason that I suggested earlier. So did Harry. I wanted to include some works that were considered too malevolent, such as Hitler's Mein Kampf, but I urge you to include it. Simply for reasons of space, Shakespeare has been left out of the text, but I absolutely assign Shakespeare. I have students discuss either Julius Caesar or one of the other great leader-follower type plays of Shakespeare. So Orwell was left out simply for reasons of space. I think it's a fabulous essay, as I said, and I would and do include it in the classroom. And the Bible was left out. That's a hard one, and I'm asked that question. So I've been asked it many times over the years. You know, I admit to being a coward. I thought if I do the Old Testament, it means I have to do the New Testament. If I do the Judeo-Christian Bible, I need to do the Quran, and it got to be so daunting that I took the cowardly route and omitted texts that were clearly religious from this curriculum. But again, this curriculum that I have is not etched in stone. It's an overarching guideline, but needless to say, individual teachers, instructors of leadership, whether how to lead or whether about leadership, will adjust the curriculum to their own taste, and they should.
And a quick follow-up from Paul, if I could. Just asking you to comment, if you would, on whether you have tried it teaching the entire book. He notes that sometimes professors find it useful or valuable to assign whole pieces of literature, and whether that's attention or whether the selections work equally well.
Yeah, I started, when I first started teaching the course, I was wildly ambitious. It's amazing any student stayed in the class. They were required originally to read much more than my students are required to read now. Once you guys, you know, if any of you ever who are listening to me really get into this leadership, the great book stuff, you are going to find yourselves so excited that you're going to have to work at stopping yourself from assigning more. For example, I just, you know, tossed off Shakespeare. Well, Shakespeare's great. It's just wonderful to teach Shakespeare. By the way, there's a film of Julius Caesar, which is amusing because it has Marlon Brando in a toga, but it's got some very good stuff in it. I show at least 2 or 3 films I should add in this course as well. One is Julius Caesar, which is a flawed but interesting film. The second film that I show is Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, arguably the greatest documentary ever, and that's the precursor to what I call Hitler Week, where we do read, as I said earlier, from Mein Kampf, and we look at this film. And I also, there's this incredibly powerful, to students and adult learners who have not seen it, film based on Milgram's Obedience to Authority, where we see people willing to shock other people and following orders, and what does this whole business mean about following orders. So the trick with this course is, gee, not what do I teach, but what do I leave on the cutting room floor.
Barbara, I'd like to pass along a question from Lissa, who asks you to speak a bit about, in your call to broaden education, she observed that it seems that we're moving as a society towards ever more specialized professional and technical education in public education, and I would add even some of our private universities. So any thoughts or sort of advice on how to think about trying to reverse this trend, or how to work within the larger context?
Right. It's one of the great, you know, education is this week's very hot topic. It's been a hot topic now for 10 years or more, but as we know, even in the last week, it's this new film and the gift that Mark Zuckerberg gave to the city of Newark of $100 million for schools. So education is on everybody's mind this week. The tension between the liberal arts and the press to be more practical has never been as great as it is right now. So people like the president of my university, Drew Faust, is forever feeling obliged to defend the virtues of the liberal arts for undergraduates. Why? Because the recession has accentuated the press to learn practical things, parents who pay a lot of money, adult learners, students themselves at whatever age they feel, oh my God, should I take a course on Mozart and Mahler when in fact I need to worry about getting a job when I graduate, or I need to worry about getting promoted in my job, and so forth and so on. Again, this idea of a core classical curriculum of leadership is not intended to fight with or take on other existing pedagogies. It is intended simply to introduce to the leadership, to the study of leadership, whether it's about leadership or how to, the idea that the traditional liberal arts here through the great books has an incredibly powerful place in this pedagogy overall. And it's remarkable to me that it hasn't happened up to now, but I am, of course, now, as you know, all those of you who write and teach, we argue something and then we find ourselves persuaded by our own argument. So I've become persuaded by my own teaching of this subject and by the book itself that there is real room for the liberal arts in the 21st century, that they're as applicable as ever, these great books, but that one, of course, has to be mindful that we are teaching this work in a 21st century context. And you will find that your students bridge that gap for you between some of the, by the way, some of the works are quite recent, but as long as you pay attention to the context within which you're operating, you will find, I think without exception, the rich rewards of this kind of classical material.
Okay. Paul asked a question which I think you began alluding to at the end of your last response, but he's curious about the teaching style and wonders if you approach it through a lecture format, whether it's Socratic, do you incorporate both? How do you balance some of your more in-depth knowledge of these texts, of the larger texts from which they're drawn, with students discovering some of the leadership truths that are embedded in the readings? So if you sort of have any comments or reflections on how the students guide you when you guide the students?
Yeah, I do. One of the great virtues of teaching this material is that nobody's right and nobody's wrong. There's no wrong answer to any question that comes up in a course or in a curriculum based on these materials. These are the great questions of the human condition. How do you have a right or a wrong answer? When there's no right or wrong answer, people love to speak. Students love to speak. I'm struck by my Dartmouth undergraduates who are incredibly active. I've just started teaching here at the Kennedy School, a high level of involvement. But as those of you who teach the so-called Socratic method know, if you let students talk too much, then you're feeling, oh my God, I'm not sure they're getting the benefit of what I have to say. So it depends on the nature of the class, it depends on the size of the class, it depends on the nature of the student, obviously. But I would say, by and large, I begin each course, I give handouts so they have some idea where we're going during this particular class session. I begin most courses by doing some speaking, but I invite, even during my own comments, which by the way, this hour is a vague prototype. Of course, we don't have the real thing because I can't hear your voices. But it's a vague prototype of what I would do in a classroom. I say vague because in a classroom I virtually never talk 30 minutes nonstop without being interrupted. And I welcome interruptions, and then if I feel I'm being interrupted too much, I say, okay, it's time to get back to what I need to tell you. So I would say adult learners love to speak even more than undergraduates do. Everybody likes to get a word in on these kinds of materials. And as I said, they don't have to feel embarrassed about being right or wrong because there's no right or wrong. So you want to encourage participation no matter how large the class. I'm not one of those who says, oh, if you have 20, it's easy to have participation. I think you can have participation when the group is large. So I believe in encouraging participation with these materials with the caveat that, of course, there is some information that I have that students typically don't at whatever level, and I want to make sure they get most of that as well.
Terrific. Oh dear, submitted a question. Was wondering whether the question that at the intersection of leadership studies and spirituality touched on when you were selling yourself.
Todd?
Yes.
I've lost you. I did not hear what, in case you were just speaking to me, I did not hear what you said.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you with an echo and static. I hope that we're still coming across properly.
Okay, why don't you let's field this, we're going to run out of time. But Odir asked a question about whether issues of spirituality
Hello, this is Ashley. I'm sorry. It looks like Todd's having some problems with his audio. Since we're about 5 minutes prior to the end of the webinar, I'm going to call it to a close, and I thank you everybody for your questions. Shortly before we end, I'd like to mention that the following individuals have won a complimentary copy of Barbara's book: Beth from St. David's, Pennsylvania; Ryan from Kennesaw, Georgia; Teresa from Vancouver, British Columbia; and Casey from Lamars, Iowa. I'd like to thank Barbara Kellerman for taking the time to be with us today for a fantastic webinar presentation and a great overview of her book and the great leadership literature, and I hope all of you appreciated it also. And with that, I wish you all a very good day and hope to see you at our next Leadership Perspectives webinar.
Thank you very